The bustling airport terminal hummed with the usual symphony of departure announcements, rolling suitcases, and hurried conversations. Travelers weaved through the crowded walkways, their minds preoccupied with flight schedules and final goodbyes. But amid the chaos, a moment was unfolding that would shake the very foundation of everyone who witnessed it. If you're here for gripping stories that keep you on the edge of your seat, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Because what happens next is something you won't want to miss. The boy sat alone near gate 32, clutching a slightly worn backpack to his chest. He couldn't have been more than 12, maybe 13. His dark skin contrasted against the crisp white linoleum floor as his fingers fidgeted nervously. His sneakers, scuffed but neatly tied, tapped anxiously against the tile. Every few moments, he lifted his gaze toward the departure screens, his wide brown eyes scanning the endless rows of flight numbers as if searching for something or someone. Most travelers passed him without a second glance, their minds too cluttered with their own concerns to notice a lone child waiting at the gate. But not everyone ignored him. Captain Rebecca Langley stood a short distance away, observing the boy with a sense of growing suspicion. She had been a pilot for over 15 years, a woman who took pride in her sharp instincts and unwavering discipline. Her uniform was pristine, her hat perfectly tilted, a badge of authority glistening under the airport's fluorescent lights. Something about the boy unsettled her. He was too still, too alert. No parents hovered nearby. No guardian seemed to be watching over him. Rebecca's gut twisted as a series of thoughts flashed through her mind. Was he lost? Abandoned? Or worse, was he up to something? In today's world, one could never be too careful. The news was filled with stories of suspicious activity at airports, human trafficking, smugglers, and even terrorists hiding in plain sight. Her fingers hovered over her radio as she debated whether to alert security. And then the boy did something that solidified her decision. He reached into his backpack, pulled out a small black device, and held it close to his chest. Rebecca's stomach clenched. A phone? A detonator? Her pulse quickened as her mind raced with possibilities. Without a moment's hesitation, she turned on her heel and strode toward the nearest security officer. "We have a situation," she said, keeping her voice steady despite the unease creeping up her spine. "There's an unattended minor at gate 32. He's behaving strangely, and I have reason to believe he may be a security risk." The officer's brows knitted together. A security risk? What exactly is he doing? Rebecca exhaled sharply. He's alone. No guardian in sight. He keeps checking the flight schedule, and just now he pulled out a device from his backpack. I don't want to take any chances. The officer's expression turned serious as he nodded. Understood. We'll handle it. Rebecca watched as two uniformed officers approached the boy, their hands resting lightly on their belts. The boy didn't notice them at first. He was still staring at the screen, his brows furrowed in concentration. "Excuse me, son," one of the officers said, his voice calm but firm. "Can we speak with you for a moment?" The boy jumped slightly, his gaze snapping up to meet the officer's. His eyes widened in alarm, darting between the two men in front of him. I didn't do anything," he stammered. The second officer crouched to his level. "We just need to ask you a few questions. Are you here alone?" The boy swallowed hard. I'm waiting for my dad. He told me to wait here." "Where's your dad now?" the officer pressed. The boy hesitated. His fingers clutched the strap of his backpack tighter. He's on a plane. He told me to stay here until he landed." Rebecca folded her arms as she observed the exchange. Something wasn't adding up. The boy looked nervous, too nervous. His story sounded shaky, like he was making it up on the spot. "What's in the backpack, son?" the first officer asked. The boy stiffened. "Just my stuff. Can we take a look?" The boy hesitated again. For a moment, it seemed like he might refuse. But then, under the weight of the officer's expectant gazes, he slowly unzipped his backpack and revealed its contents. Inside were a few crumpled clothes, a sketchbook with half-finished drawings, and a small, black tablet. The device he had been holding earlier. Rebecca frowned. It wasn't a detonator. Not even close. The officers exchanged glances. "Son, we're going to need you to come with us," one of them said gently. The boy's breath hitched. "No. I didn't do anything. My dad is coming." His voice trembled with rising panic. "We just need to check a few things, that's all," the officer assured him. "You'll be fine." The boy shook his head rapidly. "Please, I swear I'm not lying. My dad's plane lands in a few minutes. He's coming." His pleas echoed through the terminal, but the officers were already leading him away. Rebecca watched in silence, her hands clasped tightly behind her back. She had done the right thing. Hadn't she? The boy could have been anyone. He could have been a threat. She had only acted out of caution, out of responsibility. And yet, as she watched him disappear into the security office, an uncomfortable knot twisted in her stomach. Somewhere deep inside, a voice whispered, "What if you were wrong?" Rebecca tried to shake the unease creeping into her chest as she walked back toward the gate. She had done the right thing, hadn't she? Airports were high-risk zones, and a lone, nervous boy acting strangely was enough to raise suspicion. Still, the image of his wide, fearful eyes lingered in her mind. She glanced toward the security office down the hall where the officers had taken him. The glass walls gave a partial view inside. The boy sat hunched in a chair, his hands gripping the arms tightly, his backpack now on the floor beside him. One officer was speaking to him while the other made a call. Rebecca exhaled, pushing away the doubt. This was protocol. Security would sort it out. Yet she couldn't help but feel that something was off. Inside the small, windowed room, the boy whose name was Elijah sat with his heart pounding. His fingers twitched against his jeans as he fought the urge to cry. He wasn't scared of the officers. He was scared of what his dad would think when he found out. "Son, let's start with your name," the officer across from him said, keeping his voice calm but firm. "Elijah," he muttered. "Elijah, what's your last name?" He hesitated. His father had always taught him not to share too much information with strangers. But these weren't just strangers. These were cops. And he didn't want to make things worse. "Elijah Carter," he finally said. The officers exchanged a glance. The name meant nothing to them. "All right, Elijah. You said you're waiting for your dad. What's his name?" Elijah licked his lips. "He told me not to tell anyone." The second officer raised an eyebrow. "Why would he say that?" He doesn't like people knowing who he is," Elijah admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. That set off alarm bells. The officers stiffened slightly, their professional instincts kicking in. People who didn't want to be identified were often people hiding something. "Elijah, we need you to be honest with us," the first officer said, leaning in slightly. "If you're in trouble, we can help. But you have to tell us the truth. Who is your father?" Elijah swallowed hard, his mind racing. He wasn't in trouble, at least, he didn't think he was, but the way they were treating him, the way they were looking at him, made him feel like he had done something wrong. The second officer, still holding the phone, sighed. "Let's check the flight records. You said your dad is landing soon. Which flight is he on?" Elijah hesitated again before glancing toward the arrival screen he had been checking earlier. His father's flight was listed there, a Flight 729 from Washington, D.C. The officer typed quickly into his system, pulling up the flight details. He frowned. "This is a private flight," he muttered to his partner. "Not a commercial one." The first officer frowned. "Private? That changed things. Most people waiting at an airport were picking up family from commercial flights. Private flights were reserved for high-ranking officials, business tycoons, and celebrities." The tension in the room shifted. The officers exchanged another glance. "Elijah, your dad? What does he do?" Elijah lowered his eyes. "I'm not supposed to say," he whispered. That only made them more suspicious. The first officer turned toward his colleague. "Let's send someone to check that flight when it lands." Just as he said that, a crackle came through the airport radio system. "Flight 729 has landed. VIP escort team en route to the tarmac." VIP escort team? The officers stiffened. Rebecca, still watching from a distance, noticed their reaction. She frowned. Something was happening. Elijah sat up straighter. "That's him," he said quickly. "My dad's here." The officers weren't sure what to think. A moment later, the door to the security office swung open. A third officer stepped inside, his expression tense. "We've got a situation," he said. "What kind of situation?" the first officer asked. "The kind where we might have just made a very big mistake." Rebecca turned toward the terminal entrance as a sudden shift in the air made everyone pause. Security personnel, usually relaxed unless there was an incident, were suddenly stiff, standing at attention. A group of men in black suits stepped in first, their earpieces barely visible, their gazes scanning the area with sharp precision. It was clear they weren't ordinary security. They were the kind of men who only accompanied people of extreme importance. Rebecca's breath caught as she spotted the man walking in behind them. Tall, commanding. A presence that seemed to make the entire airport hold its breath. She knew that face. Everyone did. And suddenly she understood. Her stomach twisted into a tight knot as cold realization sank into her bones. She had just called the cops on the son of one of the most powerful men in the country. The airport terminal, which had been bustling just moments ago, fell into an eerie hush. It was as if every traveler, every employee, every single person who recognized the man now striding through the entrance collectively held their breath. The security officers who had taken Elijah into custody stiffened, their faces draining of color as they processed what was unfolding before them. Elijah's father had arrived. Rebecca's mouth went dry. The man walking toward the security office wasn't just important, he was one of the most powerful figures in the country. His name alone commanded respect. The officers who had detained Elijah stood frozen for a brief second before snapping into motion. One of them quickly straightened his uniform while the other glanced nervously toward the security office, as if silently pleading for the situation to resolve itself before the man reached them. Rebecca, still at a distance, felt her pulse thunder in her ears. She had called security on his son. She had assumed the worst about the boy without knowing anything. And now she was about to face the consequences. Inside the security office, Elijah's heart leaped when he heard the commotion outside. He jumped to his feet, eyes wide with hope. "That's my dad," he said, his voice breaking with urgency. The officers exchanged another uneasy glance. They had pieced together enough of the situation to know they had made a massive mistake, but now they were trapped in it. One of them turned to the third officer who had entered earlier. "Tell me this isn't who I think it is." The officer swallowed hard. "It is." The first officer clenched his jaw. Jesus. Elijah wasn't waiting anymore. Before they could stop him, he grabbed his backpack and bolted for the door. The officers barely had time to react before the door swung open and the boy ran straight toward the man now standing in the terminal. "Dad!" The man, his father, opened his arms and Elijah collided into him with a force that sent a pang of regret straight through Rebecca's chest. He wrapped his son in a protective embrace, his large hand resting on the back of Elijah's head as he whispered something Rebecca couldn't hear. The entire airport seemed to be watching. No one spoke. No one moved. Then, slowly, his eyes lifted and they locked onto the officers. His expression was unreadable, but the weight of his gaze was enough to make the two men who had detained Elijah take an involuntary step back. Rebecca saw the moment realization dawned on him. The moment he pieced together exactly what had happened to his son. And then his gaze moved again. This time it landed on her. Rebecca felt her stomach plummet. The weight of her mistake crashed down on her like an avalanche. Elijah's father didn't shout. He didn't demand explanations. He didn't have to. His very presence carried a force more powerful than anger, a quiet, restrained fury that made the officers in front of him shift uncomfortably. Elijah clung to his father's side, his small hands gripping the sleeve of his tailored coat. "They thought I was lying," he murmured, voice trembling. "They didn't believe me." His father's jaw tightened, his sharp features hardening. The lead officer stepped forward cautiously. "Sir, there was a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" His voice was calm, dangerously so. "You detained my son. You interrogated him. You treated him like a criminal." The officer visibly swallowed. "Sir, You saw a black boy sitting alone and you assumed the worst." Rebecca flinched. The words sliced through the air, cutting deeper than any shouted accusation ever could. Elijah's father finally turned his full attention to her. "And you," he said. Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. "You're the one who called security, aren't you?" She forced herself to nod. "Yes, sir." His gaze didn't waver. "And why did you do that?" Rebecca's pulse hammered. She had no good answer. I thought he was unattended. I thought something was wrong." "Something was wrong," he agreed. "But not because of him." Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. "I trusted my son to wait here for me," he continued, his voice steady. "I told him he would be safe. Instead, he was treated like a suspect. Like a threat. And now you're all standing here, realizing just how badly you've messed up." No one spoke. No one could. Rebecca wanted to look away to escape the weight of his gaze, but she forced herself to hold it. This was her mistake and she had to own it. But then he said something that made her stomach turn cold. "If my son had been white," he said slowly, "would you have done the same?" Rebecca's breath hitched. The question hung in the air, suffocating. The officers glanced at each other, but no one answered. Because they already knew the truth. The silence in the terminal was suffocating. Everyone who had been watching, passengers, airport staff, security officers, seemed to be frozen in place. No one wanted to be the first to move, the first to break the unbearable weight of what had just been said. Rebecca felt the blood drain from her face. She had no answer to the man's question, and that was the worst part. If Elijah had been white, would she have reacted the same way? Would security have treated him with the same level of suspicion? Deep down, she already knew the answer. Elijah's father exhaled slowly, as if restraining himself from saying more. He placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his grip firm, reassuring. "Let's go," he said quietly. Elijah nodded eagerly, clutching his father's sleeve as if he never wanted to let go. But just as they turned to leave, one of the officers, the same one who had questioned Elijah the most aggressively, finally found his voice. "Sir, we really do apologize for the misunderstanding." His voice was stiff, forced. "We were just following protocol." Elijah's father paused, turning back slightly. "Protocol?" His voice was dangerously calm. The officer hesitated, realizing his mistake too late. "Is it protocol," the man continued, "to assume a black child waiting for his parent is a threat? Is it protocol to detain him? To make him feel like a criminal before he's even old enough to understand why the world looks at him differently?" The officer swallowed, his face turning red. "That's not what happened. Isn't it?" Rebecca flinched at the sharpness in his tone. The second officer, the one who had checked the flight records, stepped forward carefully. "Sir, we didn't know who he was. If we had—" The man let out a bitter, humorless laugh. "If you had known who he was," he repeated, shaking his head. "And that's supposed to make it better? The problem isn't that you didn't know who he was. The problem is that you didn't think he mattered until you realized who his father was." The officer paled, realizing too late that he had only made things worse. Elijah's father stared at them for a long moment before exhaling, as if forcing himself to let it go. "Come on, son," he murmured. Elijah clutched his father's hand, eager to leave this place, this moment, behind. They turned to walk away, but before they could fully disappear into the terminal, Rebecca did something she hadn't planned. She stepped forward. "Wait." Elijah's father paused, glancing over his shoulder. Rebecca felt her heart hammering in her chest, but she forced herself to speak. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I really am." The weight of her words hung between them. For a moment, it seemed like he wouldn't respond. But then, slowly, he turned fully to face her. His expression was unreadable, his dark eyes studying her with a depth that made her feel exposed, vulnerable. "Being sorry isn't enough," he finally said. His voice wasn't unkind, but it was firm. "What matters is what you do next." Rebecca swallowed. He let the words linger for a moment before turning away again. This time he didn't stop. Elijah held onto his father's hand as they walked toward the private terminal, disappearing through the doors. Rebecca stood there, her chest tight, her mind racing. She had always considered herself a good person, someone who treated everyone equally. But today she had to face the truth. She had made an assumption based on race. And the consequences of that assumption had hurt an innocent child. As the airport slowly returned to normal around her, Rebecca knew one thing for certain. She would never make that mistake again. Rebecca stood frozen in place long after Elijah and his father had disappeared through the private terminal doors. The airport around her had resumed its usual rhythm, announcements echoed over the intercom, travelers bustled from one gate to another, and security officers returned to their posts. But she couldn't move. Her mind replayed the last few minutes over and over. What matters is what you do next. Elijah's father's words clung to her like a weight pressing down on her chest. It was easy to apologize. It was easy to feel guilty. But what did it mean to actually change? She had been so sure she was doing the right thing when she called security. She had followed a gut instinct, one she now realized had been shaped by biases she didn't even know she carried. She thought she was being vigilant, cautious, responsible. Instead, she had been unfair. She had been wrong. And she had hurt a child. In the security office, the officers who had detained Elijah sat in tense silence. The reality of what had just happened was setting in. They had detained the son of a powerful man, but that wasn't even the biggest issue. The real problem, the one that made their stomachs churn, was the ugly truth they now had to face about themselves. The lead officer rubbed a hand over his face. "We screwed up." The second officer let out a heavy breath. "Big time." The third officer, who had entered late into the situation, leaned against the wall, shaking his head. "You heard him. It's not about who the kid's father is. It's about the fact that we wouldn't have reacted the same way if he had been white." A long silence followed. None of them could argue. None of them could deny it. Finally, the lead officer pushed back his chair and stood. "I'm filing a report. This won't happen again." The other two nodded. It wasn't enough to regret what had happened. They had to be better. Rebecca didn't know how long she stood there before she finally forced herself to move. She walked toward the security office, her feet feeling heavy. When she reached the door, she hesitated. Then, gathering her courage, she knocked. The lead officer opened the door, looking just as troubled as she felt. "I need to report what happened," Rebecca said. "And I need to take responsibility for my part in it." The officer gave her a long, measured look. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Come in." Hours later, Elijah and his father sat in the back of a sleek black SUV, pulling away from the airport. The tension that had filled the boy's body was finally starting to ease. "Are you okay?" his father asked gently. Elijah nodded. But then after a pause he added, "I just don't get it. Why did they think I was lying? Why did they treat me like I did something wrong?" His father's jaw tightened and for a moment he was silent. Then, with a deep breath, he turned to his son. "Because sometimes people don't see us for who we really are," he said. "They see what they expect to see. And sometimes that means they see us as a threat before they see us as people." Elijah frowned, his young mind trying to make sense of it. "But that's not fair." His father's eyes softened. "No, it's not." Elijah looked down at his hands. "Will it always be like this?" His father wrapped an arm around him, pulling him close. "Not if we keep pushing for change," he said. "Not if we hold people accountable. Not if we refuse to let the world tell us who we are." Elijah rested his head against his father's side, thinking about that. He didn't have all the answers yet. But one thing he did know, he would never let anyone make him feel small again. And neither would his father. Back at the airport, Rebecca walked out of the security office, her heart still heavy but her mind clearer than before. She had written a full report detailing what happened. She had owned up to her mistakes. And she had vowed to educate herself, to learn, to do better. Because Elijah's father was right. Being sorry wasn't enough. What mattered was what she did next. The end.